but there is a sort of missionary impulse to sort of take over the Philippines and use that in a way to exert American values and American culture throughout the Far East.
So I'm trying not to be too heavy-handed here, but there's a real echo with the whole idea of expanding democracy, expanding free markets, bringing to people who haven't had the blessings of those values. And now we have the decision of moving in on people in a very large area who might not want those blessings as much as we'd like to give it to them.
And in fact, I think McKinley was very disappointed because in December 1898, he issues what became known as a benevolent assimilation policy, which said that the Army's mission was to sort of convince the Filipinos of America's good intentions by its own good actions.
Winning their hearts and minds.
As we would later say. And the Army High Command accepted this mission and did a great deal of what we now see is happening in Iraq. New sanitation, trying to restore the infrastructure, markets, honest government, new laws, and so forth. So there was a real hearts and minds approach, or if you want to use the current term, Phase 4 approach, from the beginning with McKinley and with the Army.
Tell us geographically about the area that we're talking about. The Philippines are an island, but this is not a tiny little island. This is a large expanse.
Well, it's actually an archipelago, and the main island of Luzon is where Americans have traditionally focused because that's where Manila is. But there's a whole, I mean, they've never really counted how many islands there are there because some of them are covered during the tide. But there's at least, on Luzon alone, there's 5 major tribal linguistic groups, so 5 different languages. And then further south, there's the Visayas chain. And then way to the south, you've got Mindanao and Jolo, which are Muslim, or large areas of Muslim, which the Americans called the Moros. So there's religious differences, there's tribal differences, there's linguistic differences, there's cultural differences. And it is so divided by water and terrain and jungle that people from one village sometimes can't converse with the people from another village across the mountains.
So there's a big temptation in Americans to see there's one pink spot called the Philippines.
Right. Why
we ought to be able to, I mean, we're going in with good hearts and we have the best of intentions, and by the way, it's very good for us to be positioned there strategically because it makes a great coaling station and a place where we can put our ships and our troops and advance out to help control instability in the rest of that region. And yet, because of this diversity of people, not everyone welcomes us there. So explain how that, briefly, how that next 2 or 3 wars, 2 or 3 years unwrapped with American forces.
Well, I mean, again, there is a sort of parallel with thinking about Iraq, that remember that the original opposition was thought to be Saddam and his tribe and his group of warlords. And we felt the same way in the Philippines. It was Aguinaldo and the Tagalogs. And once we got out of the sort of Tagalog-controlled areas around Manila, then the rest of the Filipinos would embrace us. What actually happened was that there was what we think of a conventional war, much like there was in Iraq, with American forces fighting Aguinaldo's army. And that lasted for about 6 or 7 months. After that, when Aguinaldo's army, sort of like Saddam's army, just sort of disappeared and went back to their villages, we thought the war was over. Now, there was no landing on an aircraft carrier, but the general...
Mission accomplished.
Exactly. And that was the reports coming from the High Command in Manila, that everything's gone. And we, as we did in Iraq, sent troops throughout the archipelago in every town that was major, that an American garrison was there, to restore order, restore the infrastructure, get the economy going, and show the Filipinos that Americans were well-intentioned. And there was going to be a transition to a civilian government, which actually got sent out there. However, when the Americans went into the rest of the archipelago, resistance coalesced around them. They were sort of like antibodies. Now, some of this resistance was tied to Aguinaldo and the Nationalists. Much of it wasn't. Much of it was for local reasons. It might be a local bandit, a religious sect. It might be a powerful landowning family. And so the Americans essentially attracted all the resistance and all the sort of battle over local control coalesced around the Americans.
Brian, we only have about a minute left. So tell me, 100 years ago, what vital lessons we learned after 3 years of really vicious fighting. How did we bring this to closure?
Well, the Army managed to structure at the local level a number of very effective local plans. And that changed from village to village. What worked in one town might not work in another. And gradually these were sort of, as the local successes built up, you could control entire districts and then provinces. And then the high command finally began to follow some of those policies as well and instituted a sort of archipelago-wide policy. And this was a combination of conciliation and repression. But I think the big lesson is it was much easier to get in than it was to get out.
And in fact, we were about 90 years before we actually got out of that area.
Yes.
And today remains sort of a love-hate relationship.
Exactly.
With a very good ally who nonetheless is sometimes suspicious of our motives.
And there are still, as last I heard, American troops helping in counterinsurgency in the Philippines.
Brian, it's a fascinating story. Dr. Brian Linn is the author of Echo of Battle, The Army's Way of War, his new book. But the one that really rings with the experience we're having in Iraq and Afghanistan is his book, The U.S. Army and Counterinsurgency in the Philippine War, 1899 to 1902. Dr. Brian Linn, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.